Welcome back to this, our second semester of American Literature. We're going to start this semester the same way that we did the last one, with a work of autobiography. Although, unlike Herman Melville's Typee, Booker T. Washington doesn't make any attempt to fictionalize names or give any creative storytelling flair to his narrative. That's not the purpose of his writing. So we saw in The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn how America was struggling with the problem of slavery in the 1800s, and this struggle eventually culminated in the Civil War in 1861 and lasted until 1865. With this next book that we're studying, Up From Slavery, we get to see the ending of the Civil War and its aftermath from the perspective of someone who was born into slavery during this time. So I'm not going to give you an extended account of Booker T. Washington's life story in this lecture, like I have for some other authors, because that is what the book is about. It's an autobiography. But I will mention why he was an important figure historically and some of the things that he accomplished after the events that he writes about in his autobiography, before we get into talking about the book itself. One of his biggest achievements, as you will have gathered from reading, was the founding of the Tuskegee Institute, which is still around today. It was a historically black college where students would learn not just academic subjects, but trades as well. Farming, brickmaking, carpentry, things like that. He wanted to build up the black community in America through a combination of schooling and self-help principles, what was known at the time as the principle of racial uplift. It's sort of a pull yourself up by your own bootstraps philosophy to racial equality, as opposed to trying to, say, legislate it. Booker T. Washington laid out a lot of his views in a speech that came to be known as the Atlanta Compromise speech, which he gave in 1895. In that speech, he essentially argued that for the present, black Americans should be focused on vocational or industrial training and not worrying so much about having the right to vote or dealing with segregation. He thought that those issues would sort of solve themselves as black Americans raised themselves up out of the ignorance that slavery had left them in and taught themselves these various trades. Now, understandably, these ideas had some mixed reactions. Opposition to Washington grew throughout his career as people thought he was too accommodationist towards white Americans in the South who still weren't giving black Americans their fair rights. And out of this disagreement came the NAACP, which is also still around today, and which focused on political change as opposed to Washington's approach of vocational work. So Washington was a very influential figure among businessmen, church leaders, and politicians. He met several presidents, some of whom he talks about in his book, but perhaps the most controversial meeting he had with a president came after Up From Slavery was written. He was invited to the White House to dine with Theodore Roosevelt, and many politicians, mostly from the South, felt that this was going a bit too far. They thought that being invited to eat at the White House as an equal would give Washington and then other blacks a big head and make them think too highly of themselves, and that it was going to cause all sorts of racial tension and problems. But the dinner itself apparently went well, and it was a milestone in Washington's career. So, let's take a look at Up From Slavery. The chapters that I asked you to read deal with his childhood and early education, the lengths he went to in order to get that education, and then with his founding of the Tuskegee Institute. And he begins by describing the tiny cabin where he was born and where his family lived when he was still a slave, and what daily life looked like. But even here, as early as in chapter 1, we can see that he's doing more than just relating his life story. He's not just giving us the dry, bare-bones facts, in other words. He's laying out both his philosophy of racial uplift as well as his optimistic hopes and dreams for Black Americans. So it's clear that he's writing this autobiography with a purpose in mind, not just to satisfy someone's curiosity or not just to entertain readers, as perhaps might have been Herman Melville's motive with Typee. We can get a glimpse of his optimistic tones in Chapter 1 in a longer passage that I want to read out for you, where he's talking about the future of his race in America, what he sees coming down the road as he tries to predict what's happening. He says, "I pity from the bottom of my heart any nation or body of people that is so unfortunate as to get entangled in the net of slavery. I have long since ceased to cherish any spirit of bitterness against the Southern white people on account of the enslavement of my race. No one section of our country was wholly responsible for its introduction, and besides, it was recognized and protected for years by the general government. Having once got its tentacles fastened onto the economic and social life of the Republic, it was no easy matter for the country to relieve itself of the institution. Then, when we rid ourselves of prejudice or racial feeling, and look facts in the face, we must acknowledge that, notwithstanding the cruelty and moral wrong of slavery, the 10 million Negroes inhabiting this country, who themselves, whose ancestors went through the school of American slavery, are in a stronger and more hopeful condition, materially, intellectually, morally, and religiously, than is true of an equal number of black people in any other portion of the globe. This is so to such an extent that Negroes in this country, who themselves or whose forefathers went through the school of slavery, are constantly returning to Africa as missionaries, to enlighten those who remained in the fatherland. This I say not to justify slavery. On the other hand, I condemn it as an institution, as we all know that in America it was established for selfish and financial reasons, and not from a missionary motive. But to call attention to a fact and to show how Providence so often uses men and institutions to accomplish a purpose. When persons ask me in these days how, in the midst of what sometimes seems hopelessly discouraging conditions, I can have such faith in the future of my race in this country, I remind them of the wilderness through which and out of which a good providence has already led us." So, Washington sees hope. He sees providence, in other words, God, guiding events so that good can still come out of this great evil that was slavery. He goes on to talk about the effects of emancipation on the slaves, how some of them initially celebrated wildly, but then realized that they had nowhere to go and that they had no special skills or business knowledge to put to use, and they ended up working for their old plantation masters again, only this time for a wage. And this is something that he would come to see as a problem, and something which he saw schooling as an answer to. Freedom wasn't going to benefit his race if they weren't also provided with the tools and opportunities with which to exercise it. He describes his own struggle to go to school, having to work long hours and sleeping underneath a sidewalk when he eventually traveled to Richmond, Virginia to attend school at a place called the Hampton Institute. And he talks about the various important lessons that he learned when he was there, which again, we can tell that he's trying to impart to his readers. The importance of the Bible, the importance of hard work, and even things like the importance of bathing and brushing one's teeth. Of these lessons, Washington seems to hold the importance of hard work especially high. He writes with frustration that many of the recently free Black Americans had a misguided idea of what education was, as if somehow, by being educated, they weren't going to have to work as much in the world as they would otherwise have had to. And he puts the problem pretty succinctly at the start of chapter 5. He says, "It could not have been expected that a people who had spent generations in slavery, and before that generations in the darkest heathenism, could at first form any proper conception of what an education meant. In every part of the South, during the Reconstruction period, schools, both day and night, were filled to overflowing with people of all ages and conditions, some being as far along in age as 60 and 70 years. The ambition to secure an education was most praiseworthy and encouraging. The idea, however, was too prevalent that, as soon as one secured a little education, in some unexplainable way he would be free from most of the hardships of the world, and at any rate could live without manual labor. There was a further feeling that a knowledge, however little, of the Greek and Latin languages would make one a very superior human being, something bordering almost on the supernatural. I remember that the first colored man whom I saw who knew something about foreign languages impressed me at the time as being a man of all others to be envied. So that's what he thinks the purpose of an education is. That's what he thinks that the people around him thought that an education was for. To be envied by others. To not have to do as much work. But what does he think about it? What's Booker T. Washington's notion of why we should be educated? He says that it's for a fundamentally unselfish reason. And the overall impression that we get from him is that if you're not using your education to help others, then it's been a wasted education. And that's the attitude that he brings to the Tuskegee Institute when he sets out to found it. Later on, he talks about how he personally helped in the manual labor of getting the school and the land ready so that the students would feel comfortable with lending a hand too. He says nearly all the work of getting the new location ready for school purposes was done by the students after school was over in the afternoon. As soon as we got the cabins in condition to be used, I determined to clear up some land so that we could plant a crop. When I explained my plan to the young men, I noticed that they did not seem to take to it very kindly. It was hard for them to see the connection between clearing land and an education. Besides, many of them had been school teachers, and they questioned whether or not clearing land would be in keeping with their dignity. In order to relieve them from any embarrassment, each afternoon after school, I took my axe and led the way to the woods. When they saw that I was not afraid or ashamed to work, they began to assist with more enthusiasm. So he's leading by example, in other words. He's trying to explain to his students who have these high and mighty ideas of what an education should be, look, you shouldn't be afraid to get your hands dirty. Manual labor, the trades are just as worthy of being learned and might benefit you just as much, if not more, than what you would consider this brick and mortar New England university type education, such as the kind that, say, Nathaniel Hawthorne or Ralph Waldo Emerson underwent. There's also a lot in the book about how he raised funds for the school, about how he and others would travel all over the country, and how they went about asking for donations. Well, actually, one of the things Washington says that they did was that they never really asked for anything. He says that they would sit down for a meeting and just talk about the school and about all of the success that they were having and let the results speak for themselves. Then, he says, people felt it was an honor to donate money. They were excited to contribute to it because he worked upon their imaginations and got them thinking about this amazing school. I also asked you to read chapter 14 of the book, in addition to the first 8 chapters, and that's the chapter in which he gives the Atlanta Compromise address, which we've already talked about before. And he also records some of the reactions to it. And not all of them were positive, at least at first. He describes how black ministers initially took offense at some of his comments about how many of them were saying that they were called to preach because they were either too lazy or too incompetent to do anything else. But he writes that over time, the genuine preachers in the churches admitted the truth of his complaint and helped to remedy the problem. He also talks about the response that he got from President Grover Cleveland after the speech, and once again, he gives a bit of his philosophy about how the happiest people are those who do the most for others. So, if you have time to read the rest of the book on your own, you should. You get to hear more about the struggles that he faced while running the school, financial struggles, how they made ends meet, also what the national reaction was to it, things like that. And you also get to learn more about his philosophy and beliefs as well. A very different character from some of the advocates for civil rights who came along later, and who, in some cases, I think overshadowed him a bit. But in his day, he was one of the most influential men around. The time in which he lived has sometimes been called the Age of Booker T. Washington. And that's a sort of distinction that's usually reserved for royalty, like when we'll talk about the Elizabethan Age or the Victorian era in England. So, Up From Slavery by Booker T. Washington, definitely a book worth reading all the way through. Thanks for watching.